visi, džiaugiamės jūsų sulaukę čia. Noriu jums pristatyti mūsų svečią iš Lenkijos POLIN muziejaus, tai Zachary, istorikas, tyrinėjantis Rytų Europos istoriją. Šiandien jis jums papasakos paskaitys paskaitą Holokausto tema. Iš tikrųjų, tai gal pats papasakos, ką jūs išgirsite per paskaitą. Let's start.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Laba diena. Right? Okay. So, I'm Zach. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the museum for letting me speak to all of you. I think this is a fantastic opportunity. I'm really happy to see you all here. And on a normal day, I talk a lot about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And for the past couple of months, actually, I've been traveling around the US and Canada, and I've been talking to people about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And that was an uprising that happened in 1943, in April 1943. We're going to learn a little bit about it today, but I also wanted to kind of integrate what I'm talking about into some more local history and bring this into this place where we are now, of course, the Ninth Fort, and integrate it into Lithuanian Jewish history as well. So there's a good reason why I want to talk about Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, and the reason is that for many years, people have thought and they have been convinced that Jews did not resist. And there has been this conviction, mostly based on anti-Semitic stereotypes, that Jews are passive, that they don't fight, that they're cowards, and therefore that during the Holocaust, they also didn't fight, and they just accepted their fate and went to the slaughter. And obviously that's not true, and it's quite offensive to many people, and we're going to talk about the faces of resistance, what that looked like, not just armed resistance, but other forms of resistance, and hopefully we'll get a sense of what that all looked like. But let's start from the very beginning. This, of course, should be a familiar image to you, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? This is the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569, overlaid with the current borders. So obviously it should be a familiar map to you. And why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because there's a reason why Jews ended up in this place. Uh-oh, we have an issue here. I don't know what happened here. Should be another map. I'm going to do some quick editing of the PowerPoint. There we go. How do I go back to full screen? Yep. I'll keep talking. So this is a map of the distribution of the Jewish population in the 18th century. You can see that Jews were settling mostly in what is now southwest Ukraine, but there were a lot of Jews also settling in Lithuania, in the territory around Vilnius, and places further west. So why did the Jews start settling here in the first place? They settled here because of the unique structure of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was not exactly a centralized state. I'm sure many of you learn about it in school. Hopefully this is an integral part of what you learn about in school. And it was a very strange place. So you had a lot of areas that were controlled by noblemen, and the noblemen basically could do whatever they wanted in these territories where they owned a bunch of property. And they owned, within those areas, they owned towns and villages. And to the towns, they were inviting Jews to come to fulfill certain roles. So they became important economically within the society of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And because of their importance, they would also have the ability to negotiate privileges. So remember that during this society, this is not a society based on individual rights, but a society that was based on privileges gained or given by the ruler. So in this case, Jews were given a lot of freedom. They were free people. They became quite wealthy and learned. and became obviously an integral part of the society. The two portraits here of the women are quite famous. They're from the late 18th century. They are supposedly the first portraits of Jewish women from Eastern Europe. And the woman on the right was supposedly, her name was Haika, she was supposedly the lover of the king, and the woman on the left was her daughter, Ella. But the point here being that they are shown to be powerful women and wealthy. Here we have a map of Jewish communities in Lithuania. You can see that they are quite numerous in the 18th century. And of course, then we get to the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 18th century, 1795. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceases to exist. And then we go through another period, but I'm going to jump over the 19th century because there's too much to do, we have too much going on, so we'll have to understand that 19th century is a transformation period. We go from a feudal society to a society of individual rights. We get to World War I, World War I happens, and then at the end of World War I we get this map, right? And we get an independent Lithuania, of course, with its capital here in Kaunas. Should I start over for you guys?
No, it's okay.
No, okay, good. I'm just kidding. So we get here to this point when we have an independent Lithuania and an independent Poland as well, which is important for our story with its capital there in Warsaw. The population of interwar Lithuania was, as you can see, this is based on the census data from 1923. Jews were the second largest group of people who lived in the country, the largest minority group. The percentage doesn't really show you in that amount, but there were a large amount of Jews living in Kaunas, in the capital city, as well in other cities of Lithuania. This is a map of all the Jewish communities, the official Jewish communities of independent Lithuania. And as you can see from the number of them, there were Jews living basically all over the country. Okay, and Lithuanian Jews were an integral part of the society. As you can see here, Lithuanian soldiers, home for Passover, and on the right side there are students at the university, the Tautos Magnus University, celebrating, drinking something. What are they drinking? I don't know. Probably vodka, right? And here are some scouts. These are Lithuanian Zionist scouts from Hashomer Hatzair, and they're quite an important group for our story because a lot of the people who ended up resisting, the Jews who were most active in resistance movements, were in scouting as young people, and there's a reason for that. Once you became part of an organized group that was part of a political party working towards certain goals, do you want to sit down? No? Okay, there's some seats over here. Okay, great. And once you became part of a political group that was working towards certain goals, then obviously this helped people to become more organized in the future. All right, then we get to 1939. And in 1939, of course, Poland was invaded both by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. At that point, Lithuania was under a sort of agreement with the Soviet Union. Of course, I'm sure that you are all very familiar with that complicated history. But important for our story is that Warsaw, there in the middle, becomes occupied by Nazi Germany and not the Soviet Union. So what happens to the Jews in Poland? At this point, the city of Warsaw had the largest Jewish community in Europe. There were about 350,000 Jews living in Warsaw in 1939, so that would be what, larger than the city of Kaunas today? Yes? So a very large group of Jews living there. After the Germans and Soviets invaded, there was a movement of people, of internal refugees moving back and forth, and ultimately at its peak, there were 450,000 Jews living in Warsaw in about 1940. And what the Nazis did is they told all of the Jews that they had to move into this one neighborhood, into the so-called ghetto, which they referred to as the Jewish residential district. That was their euphemism for it, their term for it. And at the start, the borders were fluid, so people had to live there, but they could move back and forth to a job or whatever outside the ghetto. Then in 1940, in November 1940, they built a wall, and this is when you get to the point that would probably be more familiar to many of you, the walled ghetto where people were not allowed to leave. Then in 1941, in June 1941, we get to a point where the Holocaust actually begins. And this begins with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And as the Nazi German soldiers, along with their allies from other countries that are listed there, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they are invading the Soviet Union, and behind the front lines are the so-called Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing units that are gathering up Jews from where they live and killing them, mostly using bullets. So this is not a point at which you have camps and gassing and all that kind of stuff that would be familiar from movies such as Schindler's List. All right. So, as many of you should know, the Holocaust really begins in Lithuania. The first instances of mass killing of Jews and really purposeful killing of Jews, because when we talk about the Holocaust, it doesn't begin in 1939, not because there wasn't persecution of the Jews, but it begins in 1941 because this is when there was purposeful killing of the Jews in particular. And so this begins in the Banderai, right? Is that how you pronounce it? How do you pronounce it? Yes? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, thank you. These forests around Vilnius, this is considered to be really the first action of the Holocaust. There were also a number of pogroms by locals, including in Poland, in the summer of 1941 when the Soviets retreated and the Nazis were coming in. In some instances, the Nazis hadn't even arrived yet, such as in Jedwabne in Poland and a few other places around there. There were locals who were murdering the Jews. And in the Ninth Fort, of course, there is this famous great action in October of 1941 when over 9,000 Jews were brought here and killed in a single day. And on that single day, Sara Gnaite, she decided, as she says, this is a quote from her testimony, she says, "At this moment, I decided I'm not going to die how the Germans prepared for me. I will join any underground organization, and I will really be the master of my fate." And this is a famous photograph of her taken by a Soviet officer in 1943. She did join an underground organization. She joined what was called the Anti-Fascist Fighting Organization, and she participated in resistance for years. Amazingly, did many wonderful things. She was attacking German units, but she was also gathering food and helping people within the ghetto, escaping to the forest, coming back, helping people, and really just an amazing figure who lived, as you can see, a very long time. She lived until she was 94, and she was a professor at Vilnius University after the war. And at this point, when this photograph was taken, it's quite an interesting story actually. She was wandering through this town, as you can see, and she saw a man approaching her who was armed, and she pointed her rifle at the man and said, "Stop, who are you? Identify yourself." And he started laughing, and he said, "You know, I'm from the Red Army, you're safe, don't worry." And then he took a photograph of her, and that was this photograph. All right. So Sara Gnaite's reaction to the situation, to say that she was witnessing this great action here in Kaunas, and saying that she would not let herself be taken, she would not let herself become a victim, is one reaction to that situation. The famous Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg, he was the person who basically wrote the very first history of the Holocaust. It's called The Destruction of European Jewry. It's a 2-volume book. It's like this thick. None of you will ever read it. It's fine. But anyway, he put together a typology of Jewish reactions to the Holocaust. And the first one on there is armed resistance. That one's self-explanatory, but it is also rare. Not everyone is going to look at this situation and react in exactly the same way as Sarah Gunaitai did and say, I'm going to pick up a gun and I'm going to go fight. Other people are going to say, I will look for some kind of way to avert danger, and that would be alleviation. Alleviation would be another kind of reaction, just trying to diminish the effects of whatever is going on. And that could be through petitions, it could be through bribery, or some kind of ransom. Another reaction would be evasion. So this would be a position that says, all right, there is something happening here, I need to hide, right? And that would perhaps be one of the more common responses, a kind of flight response. Paralysis would be another response. Paralysis is hopefully self-explanatory. You're facing a scary situation, and all of a sudden you cannot move, you cannot make a decision. There are certain personalities that would react this way. And finally, there is compliance. Compliance would be a kind of belief that if I do what they're telling me to do, then they will let me live. If I follow instructions, then they will let me live. And that, of course, is not a successful strategy, let's say, for the most part. Most people who end up complying are not the ones who are going to survive. So, but we'll look at some examples of this. I have a picture here of Rachel Auerbach. She is a very famous figure for her actions of resistance, but she never picked up a gun or anything. She was involved in a group called Oyneg Shabbos, and it was a group of intellectuals within the Warsaw Ghetto who started archiving what was happening within the ghetto. And part of what she did in particular was she was doing interviews with people who had escaped from camps. So there were people who had escaped from the Panerai forests who came to the Warsaw Ghetto, and she interviewed them. She then was trying to let the world know what was happening. She also interviewed people who escaped from Treblinka, a death camp, and in many other cases, she was a very important figure, and she obviously survived the war. She moved to Israel after the war, but then she died of breast cancer. Okay. So then in 1942, getting back to our narrative, we get the creation of these camps, of death camps in particular. The Nazis at some point decided that having people shoot and kill Jews in person was too painful for their soldiers. It was too difficult, it was too time-consuming, too expensive, and so they decided to come up with different ways of killing Jews, in particular through gassing, and this is what was used in various places. In Treblinka and in Chełmno, for example, they were using the exhaust from engines, not the Cyclone B that is kind of more famous from Auschwitz and other places. All right. Oh, just a note, on this map on the far right, you can see Warsaw, and Warsaw is very close to Treblinka, and that is the place where most of Warsaw's Jews were killed. So the great deportation action begins in July 1942 in Warsaw, and this is a picture of the Umschlagplatz, the kind of transfer station where Jews were brought during that period, and they were brought here in about groups of 6,000 to 8,000 per day, which is really mind-blowing. 6,000 to 8,000 people per day being brought to this spot and then brought to Treblinka. And Treblinka was not a place where anybody was going to survive, going to work or anything, but people were killed basically within 24 hours, anybody who arrived there was dead. And I want to talk about how this works, because you might be thinking, okay, how is this actually working? How can people do this? How does this all work in terms of authority? So at the top of this hierarchy, we have Heinrich Himmler, who was a Nazi asshole. I hope that's an okay word to say. He was a terrible person, and he was in charge of the Gestapo, the secret police, and the SS. The SS was a paramilitary group within the Nazi Party, and both of those groups had control of a Jewish council. Now, the Jewish council was an organization that existed in every ghetto, and it was made up of Jewish elites who were adopting the strategy of compliance. So when we talk about those different strategies of reacting to the Holocaust, they were thinking that if we comply with German orders, then we will make it through this. And their strategy was essentially looking at the situation and saying, anti-Jewish sentiment is not new. Controlling Jews and putting them into ghettos is not new, right? In the history of Judaism. So if we comply with their orders, maybe some of us will die, but some of us will survive, and that'll be okay. Of course, that was not a correct strategy. So the Jewish Council was also in charge of a group of Jewish police. There were Jewish police, again, in every ghetto. There was a group of Jewish police. Within the Warsaw Ghetto, that was made up of about 2,500 people. And those 2,500 people were the ones who were physically bringing Jews to the Umschlagplatz every day. And why were the Jewish police participating in this? Because they thought that they could save themselves and save their families. So again, compliance, right? And that was not true. At the end of the Great Deportation Action, the Jewish police and their families were also killed. But they all managed to bring about 300,000 people in total to Treblinka and kill them. This is a picture of the Jewish police, of some of them. This is the leader of the Jewish police, Lakin. He was apparently a very short and very angry person. And you can see that these people were treated like soldiers. They were kind of playing dress up in that way. But so during the Great Deportation Action is when we arrive at the first instance of real resistance against the Holocaust within the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. I shouldn't say real resistance, armed resistance. And what was preventing people from having armed resistance before this point? The issue was that people were too atomized. They were too separated by their own ideological differences. These three men here, they represent three different political parties that were all working at cross purposes in the Warsaw Ghetto. Despite the fact that the Warsaw Ghetto was not a pleasant place to be, it was very crowded, people were starving, politics continued. People still were producing political newspapers, there were discussions, there was an attempt to gather support for certain political ideologies. And these three men were part of different parties. Mordechai Anielewicz was a Zionist, Yitzhak Zuckerman was also a Zionist, but a different kind, and then Marek Edelman was a Bundist, which meant that he believed that the place for the Jews was actually in Europe and not somewhere else like the Zionists believed. In any case, in July of 1942, when they are witnessing this Great Deportation Action, they decide to start working together, and they form the Jewish Combat Organization. The Polish acronym for it is JOB, Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa. And so they came together at this point, and I mentioned the outlay of this Jewish police before, because at the point when they start coming together and they start doing something about their situation, they are attacking first and foremost the Jewish police, because they believe that they are the most evil, right? They're collaborating with the Nazis, and of course they become the first targets of Jewish armed resistance. But after the Great Deportation Action, most people are generally pretty despondent, as you can imagine. 300,000 Jews are killed. There were about 30,000 to 50,000 Jews still in the ghetto. Most of them were working, so they were young. relatively strong, and at this point they had really lost everything. They'd lost their families, they'd lost everyone they knew, and they became extremely depressed, as you can imagine. But in January 1943, the Germans came back and they attempted to clear the ghetto entirely of the rest of its inhabitants. And at that point, the Jewish Combat Organization responded. They attacked the Germans who were coming into the ghetto, and they actually fought off the Germans in January of 1943. And at that point, everything changed. People became much more hopeful for the future. They started thinking about how they could survive. What can we do? What can we actively do to start surviving? And what they do is they start building bunkers. So all over the Warsaw Ghetto, people started constructing amazing bunkers. So this is a model that we have in our museum collection. This is a drawing, obviously, of the bunker, but you can see up on the left side is a secret entrance and then a tunnel going down. And then this is a brick wall that's actually on rails so that it could be moved. And it was a 2-ton brick wall that could be moved on rails. And then these different cells, rooms that could be entered through this secret entrance. So there was a lot of ingenious kind of work going on throughout this period. People were really preparing for the future, and this is the great change that happens after January 1943. And it really only takes people about a month. So it's only in 1 month they managed to build a series of bunkers. Some of them are connecting a bunch of basements all together to form these bunkers. And the idea was, of course, that people could hide out, and hopefully within 3 months, maybe 6 months, the war would be over, and then they would be free, right? If we go back, if you're interested in the kind of minute details of World War II, at the beginning of 1943, the war is not going well for the Germans. And so many people started to believe that the Germans would lose, and it was only a matter of weeks, maybe months, before the war would be over. So in April of 1943, on the 19th, in fact, the Germans came back. The Germans came back because they thought that they could finally clear the rest of the ghetto, and they came back much better prepared than they did in January. They came with tanks and machine guns, armored personnel carriers, and all kinds of heavy equipment. And they had even trained special units for this operation. But, of course, the Jewish fighters within the ghetto had also prepared. Some of them had even managed to either steal or purchase on the black market a heavy machine gun, and they fought off the Germans for 3 days on the main square of the ghetto. And at this point, so there were about 1,000 to 2,000 Jewish fighters going up against this heavily armed German force. And it was really quite an amazing moment, especially considering how few weapons the Jewish fighters actually had. So they did not gain a lot of support from the outside. There were not a lot of people who were willing to give them weapons. And also, the purchase of weapons on the black market was extremely expensive. So if you can imagine, someone wants to escape from the ghetto and then look for a place to hide, maybe bribing someone to help them. The cost of one gun would be the same cost as saving one life. And so the kind of decisions that were being made at this point were quite difficult. But some people wanted revenge against the Germans so badly, or they just wanted to be able to control their own fate, to control their own destiny, and so they decided to spend this money, to spend their energy and their life, really, on fighting against the Germans. So about that, about the attitude of Poles in particular and the outside world looking at this, this is from a diary that was found at Majdanek. We don't know much about her. We only know her name, Marylka, We don't know her last name, but we know that she was hiding inside the ghetto. She was inside of one of these bunkers and observing the whole situation. And from her position, she wrote, "Behind the red wall, there is yet another wall, a thick wall of indifference and lack of consideration that Poles have built around themselves. If the attitude of Poles towards us, oppressed and persecuted to death, had been different, a significant percentage of us would have survived." And you can feel her anger, her emotion at this situation where she feels that she's been abandoned, and she's hiding out in the ghetto, and there was no one who was willing to help at that point. Meanwhile, back to Kaunas, the beginning of the uprising was quite an inspiring moment for many people. People also started preparing bunkers here. They were gathering weapons for fights, and there were some battles between Jewish fighters and the Germans in October of 1943. From one memoir, a rabbi who was hiding out in the Kaunas ghetto was hiding out, and he had a moment where his compatriots were telling him, "Rebbe, there are weapons hidden in there. We think you have to learn how to shoot. We will no longer let ourselves be slaughtered like sheep." So you can see that the sentiment there is quite universal, that people are not willing to let themselves be killed any longer. So meanwhile, back in Warsaw, inside the bunkers, people are hiding out, and Leon Nyberg was thinking specifically about this idea that I told you before, that people would hide out until the end of the war, but he's obviously quite upset about this. You can see that he calls it a tomb, as if he's already in his grave. Warsaw wrote at this point, there were about 30 people in this sweatbox instead of the planned 12, and more people kept on arriving from the burning shelters. So many people were gathering up based on their political party or their friend group or their family and planning these bunkers, but then during the uprising, other buildings started to burn, and we'll get to why in a minute. And then more and more people started to gather together into these crowded shelters, and it became a serious issue. Why were the buildings burning? The buildings were burning because the Germans, at a certain point, after a few days of fighting against fighting against the Jewish insurgents, they decided that they could not win. And so what they did was they changed strategy, and they started going house to house and burning every single building down. And once those buildings were burning, the structure of the house, even if it was a brick building, the structure was wooden. So once the wood burned, the entire house would collapse. And obviously, if there was a bunker underneath the house, then the bunker would also collapse. So Sedlak Okonovsky writes, "Who would have thought that the German bandits would have set the entire ghetto on fire along with the people hiding in it?" And here we have a photograph that was taken by a Polish firefighter who was inside the ghetto. And that Polish firefighter, he was brought into the ghetto along with a large group of firefighters because the Germans, they wanted to make sure that the ghetto would burn, but that it wouldn't spread to the rest of the city. So they brought in a bunch of firefighters, and this particular firefighter, Zbigniew Grzywaczewski, he decided, he was quite sympathetic to the Jewish cause, he was even helping to hide Jews, but he decided that because he was called into the ghetto, he would bring his camera with him at great risk to himself, obviously. But he wanted to document this and take photographs to show what was happening. And these photographs are extremely valuable because most of the photographs that we have from the Holocaust, from the Second World War in general, are taken by the Germans. And there's a serious issue with that. If we're looking at what the Germans wanted us to see, then we're essentially looking at Nazi propaganda all the time. And a lot of the photographs that we have from the Nazis, they are taken to a purpose, right? They can even be staged. So we don't even know if what we're looking at is something that is a representation of the reality, or is it just something that is a representation of Nazi ideology. And so any photograph that we have from someone else is an extremely valuable document to this period. And so that's why these pictures are so fantastic. Up until very recently, we only knew about 8 of them. There were only 8 that were known. And in preparation for the exhibition that we had at our museum for the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, our curator was talking to Chibachevsky's son and kept on bothering him and nagging and calling him and saying, hey, just look again, look through your dad's stuff, please, 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 please. And he finally did look through one last box that he hadn't checked since his father had passed away, and he found this roll of film. And all of a sudden we had 33 new photographs from this collection that he had taken inside the ghetto during the uprising. And these are really amazing photographs. If you want to see the full collection, you have to go to Warsaw, and you have to go to the museum and walk through the exhibition that we have, and you can see the whole thing. But I'm going to share a couple more with you. So the 2 photographs that were just on the screen, those were from that collection. Here are some more. And I'm going to also explain why this is important that we have these photographs and not other photographs from this collection. So these 2 photos you can see are Jews who are being led away. So Jews who were captured during the uprising were led away to the camps to be killed, obviously. Very few of them survived, as you can imagine. But these photos are taken from up inside of a building. And Zachary was, seems like he was quite rushed because these photos are blurry. Here are a couple of other shots where he was a little bit more comfortable. Here are some more of the firefighters with their engine. And on the right side, we have a bunch of Singer sewing machines and some of the firefighters there. But this photograph, I think, is one of the most impactful from the whole collection, and because it really captures the moment of this period when people have been trying so hard to survive. All these people, if you imagine, right? It's 1943. They've been resisting. They've been fighting for their lives for all this time, and now they seem to have failed. And now it's over. And you can see that there are some people being carried by their loved ones or their family. This woman here is looking back at where she came from. The little boy up in the right also looking back at where they came from. A quite impactful photo. And I want to compare that now. This is a photo from the Nazis. The Nazis were taking photographs during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising also. And it was put together into a collection called the Stroop Report, named after Jürgen Stroop, who was the SS commander of this operation. And this photo does not show the same desperation at all. In fact, these people don't look like they're starving. They don't look like they've been burnt into shelters or anything. We have nice matching outfit. These people look well fed, and there's a purpose to that. The purpose is to show that the Jews are lying when they talk about their suffering, that they're being supported by international organizations, and that they're essentially doing fine in the ghetto, and any other information to the contrary is just not true. So there's a clear propaganda purpose to this photograph. And here we have Jürgen Stroop himself. He's there in the middle. And this is another propaganda photograph. Obviously, he's shown to be glorious and looking at his work here in the burning ghetto. Jürgen Stroop was arrested after the war, originally tried by the Americans for his role in killing POWs, American POWs, and then he was extradited to Poland in 1951 and then hung in 1952. But before then, in May of 1943, he decided that the uprising was over. So the uprising lasted for about a month, from April 19th to May 16th. This date of May 16th is rather arbitrary, but it was the date that Jürgen Stroop decided the uprising was over. And to celebrate this moment, he strapped a bunch of explosives to this grand synagogue that was in Warsaw and turned it into this. So unfortunately, we don't have that synagogue anymore. But the entire ghetto was rubble, as you can see. These are photographs from inside the ghetto right after the uprising. as they systematically burned all of these buildings down. And this is the entirety of the ghetto being burned. You can see there is what appears to be one large building in the background that actually isn't even a building, it's just a facade, just the front of a building, but the entire structure of the building was also destroyed, and that was the ghetto prison from that period. But there were some people who continued to live on in the rubble, amazingly, and so Leon Nyberg is one of those amazing people, and he wrote, I have been accepted to a combat unit called the Rubblers. The group is made of 25 young Jewish boys. The arms at our disposal are 4 FPV's pistols, 1 Colt, 3 FN pistols, 2 cylinder guns, and 8 grenades. Our task is to defend unarmed Jews who are still in the rubble, self-defense, and finally, to fight the informants. Leon Nyberg is another amazing figure. He was a very young man during this period, only 17 years old, and he fought in the Warsaw Uprising, managed to survive in the rubble until September, then he made his way out. Then he fought in the Warsaw Uprising. There was another uprising in Warsaw in 1944. He survived that too. And then in 1949, he decided to move to Israel, where he started a family, and he lived so long, you can see that he lived a ripe long age, that he met 11 of his great-grandchildren. So truly amazing person. But, of course, survivors were the exception in all of this. As you can see, the population of Jews in Poland went to a very small number. In 1950, these are the numbers from 1950, Poland had about 3.2 million Jews before the war. That number dropped to 45,000 only. About 90% of Lithuanian Jews were killed during the war as well. And of course, the human capacity for doing horrible things has not ended with the Second World War, as we can see with the recent events in Ukraine, where people are suffering all the time. And this is not just the attitude of people who are obsessed with anti-Semitism necessarily, but there is something in our humanity that is fundamentally wrong that allows people to do things like this. Okay, so you're all young. We can't end on a terrible note. We have to have some concluding thoughts that are hopefully a little bit more positive. One thing I want to say, first of all, is that bad things happen when good people stay silent. There were so many people who were involved in this situation, so many people who knew what was happening was wrong and decided not to say anything. So use your voices to speak up when you see something wrong. The other lesson that I think comes out of what we've seen from this history is that real resistance only happens when people work together. What I mentioned with the Jewish Combat Organization, there were so many people who were working at cross purposes, not working together, only thinking about themselves. And you could also think about all the individuals who are involved in this situation, who are thinking about their own survival or their family's survival, but not thinking about their neighbor. And real change can happen when we support our neighbors and support each other. And then we can solve the biggest problems or prevent the biggest disasters. And that is all. You have any questions? Feel free to ask any questions. Just want to talk about Netflix? No? K-pop? No? Okay. No questions at all? No? Everyone's too shy? What about the teacher? Does the teacher have questions? Who are the teachers? These two? No?
I would like to ask you about the casualties. I didn't hear that. How many Jews who resisted?
Yeah.
In the fight, they were shot in the fight and so on, not captured and brought to different camps and killed, but shot in the battle. And on opposite side, how many Nazi Germans were killed? And it was an effective choice.
So it's very hard to answer either question. We know of the people who survived. There were a couple of dozen, so maybe 25 or so people who survived the fight. So that would mean that probably almost 2,000 died fighting. Jews died fighting. There were some people like the leader of the Jewish combat organization, Mordechai Anielewicz. He famously refused to be taken. So his bunker was found by the Germans at some point, and so he and the people who were with him committed suicide rather than being taken. So there were some situations like that. In terms of German casualties, we really have no idea. So because the sources we have to go on are either witness testimonies who were claiming that there were hundreds of casualties, or the German report from Jürgen Stroop, who claims that there were 0 casualties. So somewhere in between. Somewhere in between. We really don't know. Very hard to tell. But thank you for the question.
And as you continued, sorry.
Yeah.
go back.
That's okay, yeah.
Let her,
Do
yeah.
you think that other countries were involved as well? Because I know that there was famous hero in Poland, and he tried to send the messages to other countries as well, like to I think England.
Yes, so Jan Karski is
Yes.
is this famous messenger who
Yes.
was So he managed to get to England, but he even went to the United States. He
Yeah.
spoke to Congress, he spoke to the President of the United States. Yes, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and nothing was done. Yes, nothing was done. But it's also important to keep in mind that he spoke to those world leaders in 1943. And so many vast majority of the Jews who were going to die in the Holocaust were already dead. Not to say that there shouldn't have been something done, but just saying that the time to prevent this genocide was much earlier, right? There were so many things that could have been done. And of course, the United States was completely complicit in a lot of these things, because there was a time when Jewish refugees were trying to leave Europe in the 1930s, and they were refused. The United States would not take them. There's a famous case of a boat that left specifically full of children, and it left Portugal and went to the United States. They refused to take them. Then they went to Cuba. Cuba decided, okay, we'll take 2 people or 4 people or something like that. And then they tried to go back to the United States, refused. Then they ended up back in Spain, or back in Portugal, and then most of them were killed in the Holocaust. So, there are very unfortunate situations where really nobody was willing to help the Jews during this period. So.
Do you think there is any way we could avoid situations like that in the future?
To avoid them entirely, I would hope. I would hope that that human beings are going to realize that we don't need to hurt each other anymore. But unfortunately, there are situations like the war in Ukraine. There are people in the Russian army who are committing these atrocities, and there's something wrong with our minds that we can just kind of switch and all of a sudden become so brutal to each other. So I don't know if we can get rid of that entirely. I would like to think so. We can treat people with kindness, as your bag says. Yeah.
And I ask, how much of this information is presented to the Polish high school students? They study the resistance, the Holocaust.
Yeah. So too little. But the Holocaust. We were talking about this yesterday. The Holocaust has only very recently become an integral part of the Polish education system. It depends on the teacher, but for many years there was no mention of the Jews until the Holocaust. So basically, students would learn about all of the kings of Poland and dukes and all this kind of stuff, and then get up to the 20th century, and all of a sudden, and lots of Jews were murdered, but the students have no idea who Jews are, right? So it doesn't really even make any sense. And it also doesn't do it justice because, like I was talking about, the Jews were an integral part of all of these societies, Lithuanian society and Polish society and and Russian society, but you know, this is not taught in that way. So there has been a recent change, but I think it's been like a back and forth, because the current government is a much more far-right government. They're interested in emphasizing Polish suffering and not so interested in talking about Jews. And so it's sort of been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But thankfully, our museum is a huge help. Over 600,000 Polish students have been to our museum. And we work with teachers. We have many teachers who are going through training programs at our museum, and they're integrating Jewish history into the classroom. So it's changing, but it's slow. And how much of this has been part of your education?
Quite a lot, actually.
Quite a lot. Great. Good. I'm glad. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to thank you so much for coming, visiting us, and for giving such an interesting lecture and sharing so valuable information with us. Thank you.
Thank you.